Okay, good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are across Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to this webinar series for VMware in healthcare. We're excited to be with you today. This series, two-part series, because we've got lots of information to divulge to you, is really about making you successful in your end-user computing modernization journey. So we're going to be talking about best practice, lessons learned, so what to do and what not to do. We'll talk about some trends and customer observations from not just locally, but also the US. Do some technology fundamentals and architecture fundamentals, really helping you across the two sessions to be successful in your journey along the EUC, in the EUC world. So my name is Will Dallander-Jones. I'm the lead architect for end-user computing across Australia and New Zealand. I'm joined by Farid and Barbara. Barb in person as well. We're excited to be doing a little news anchor thing today. I'll get both of them to introduce themselves shortly because I would do it a complete injustice. Suffice to say that they are both members of our dedicated healthcare practice within VMware, and they've both got extensive experience outside VMware in industry and being customers themselves. So before we get into it, just a quick bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded, as you'll have just seen. Because we're in webinar format, you are all muted. So please ask questions in the Q&A panel. Don't use the chat. We want it in the Q&A because then we get a record of it. And we can follow up if we don't quite get to them in this session, and we'll try and address them in the second session as well. So please use the Q&A, and we are going to make it nice and interactive. So hopefully it gives you some ideas. So please ask away. So as I mentioned, we're in a two-parter today. So today is really around the strategy. What are the trends and the things we're seeing from our customers and within the industry that you should be considering now as you're planning that journey? And we'll also cover some technology fundamentals around how can VMware help you along that journey. And so really, as I say, it's about the strategy. It's about how we can be helping you sort of do that planning. The second session, which is the same time next week, you should have that calendar invite. If you haven't already, it'll be coming again via the marketing team. But next week is around how do you get there? So how do we reduce the risk of change? How do we deliver incremental value, do it quickly and very successfully? So we're going to talk about some key questions and design decisions that we've been hearing from many of the customers who are on this call over the past, particularly the past year or so. So some very front of mind questions. Talk about the best practices and lessons learned from some of our largest and most complex deployments. And really it's about the process and that planning component, because much of those learnings, a lot of them have gone into the R&D team to come out as product enhancements, but actually there's a lot around the methodologies and how we approach this that's really important. So that's what's to look forward to next week. So without further ado, let's crack into today and the strategy side of things. Farid, I'm going to pass to you. So do you want to introduce yourself and take us through a bit of the background as to some of the industry and regulatory things that have been happening in the US and I suppose the history of VMware in healthcare?
Well, thank you, Will. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on this on the panel here. My name is Farid Egahi. I'm a technical strategist in the healthcare group at VMware. Been with VMware for about 12 years. I come from healthcare IT. My prior background is responsibility for the architecture and engineering of clinical computing for a very, very large provider in the United States. And my work at VMware is mostly focused on engaging with customers around strategy, process, the various aspects of the journey. I'm an engineer by training, so there's a lot of architecture, conversation, process, and operational considerations. Real quick, this is just a very high-level view of the journey in the US, and the upper part of this continuum kind of connotes the regulatory aspects that started back in 2009 with some federal regulations and policies that were finalized. And those policies were really focused on improving patient outcomes by way of essentially digitizing healthcare. What that really translates to is effectively removal of paper in the care delivery processes, replacing it with a single source of truth called EMR, electronic medical records, or EHR as the term goes. And that has been in across multiple stages in the US, and we're kind of past stage 3 and into really more of an interoperability program between the various providers from a data perspective. Again, the focus is improving patient outcomes. On the lower side of this continuum, you'll see the more or less the guidepost around how VMware has been tracking this journey in various forms. I joined just about the time we formed a healthcare vertical at VMware. Around 2011, we introduced our first technology solutions in this space called Always On Point of Care. There's plenty of things to read on the internet on that solution, and that solution has been adopted by a large part of our customers, really focused on availability and resilience. And along the way, we've had alliances with EMR vendors such as Epic and Cerner and Allscripts, effectively putting together solutions that work in conjunction with the EMR offerings. So as part of this process, there are obviously learnings that comes by way of adoption of technologies, and we have a very large set of customers in the US and globally for that matter that have adopted our solutions along those lines.
Well, thanks, Farid. So Barb,
Sure.
Do you want to give your background? You know, who are you and where have you come from?
Sure. So my background is that I have worked for hospital operators or providers in the Australian, New Zealand market for a couple of decades. My background is entirely in infrastructure. Prior to VMware, I joined around 2 years ago. Prior to that, my most recent role was as CTO for HealthScope, which in Australia runs around 40 plus hospitals nationally. And at the time I joined, also owned 75% of pathology businesses in New Zealand. But just relating it to this continuum, this obviously is highlighting events, major events that have driven the healthcare or digital healthcare industry in the US. From an ANZ perspective, back in 2010, I worked for Sydney Adventist Hospital, also known as the SAN at that time, and triggered by an EMR rollout as a customer, we implemented Follow Me desktops and adopted that always on point of care architecture. So in the ANZ market as well, these solutions and approaches are very well proven, both in healthcare and across other industries as well.
And thanks, and that's probably a good segue to Farid. You know, do you want to perhaps talk about some of those use cases you mentioned? Follow Me desktop. What are you seeing over there with this list?
Right. Yeah. The initial journey started with very much focused on some very direct value proposition for the clinicians, and most organizations kind of looked at VDI as effectively accomplishing two things simultaneously. One is to simplify the overall operation and configuration management of these complex platforms. Number two, it also provided a very direct value to the clinicians in the form of what's commonly referenced as Follow Me desktop, where clinicians effectively have that initial authentication into their desktops, and then from that point on, for the duration of the shift, they would go around and effectively quote, carry their desktop. In fact, they're not carrying their desktop, obviously. They're pointing to the same instance of Windows, and to them, it obviates the need for multiple authentication steps and generally facilitates a much more fluid way of accessing applications throughout the facilities. That has since obviously evolved into application virtualization, and most organizations have now use cases that go way beyond the clinical space into the offshore space, the coding space, and obviously mobile is very much part of the overall project. But this is a partial list of customers in the US that have adopted the technology, and like I mentioned earlier, most of them have gone beyond that initial VDI value proposition and exploring additional capabilities.
So Farid, this list is quite hospital centric. There's a lot of other ancillary services and providers that feed into the ecosystem for clinical delivery. So what about those? What about radiology, pathology, medical device companies, and so on?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I can speak from direct experience myself. When I was at a large provider, and whose name is actually on this list, one of the things that we noted was the fact that once the EMR transformation kind of took place and EMR became more of the central cog in the overall set of application ecosystem, many other applications kind of snapped into that framework. And back in the day, we call them circle of support. That was a term that we used, where these ancillary applications, be it pharmacy, radiology, biomed, and what have you, they effectively are brought into the same ecosystem fundamentally because most of the applications end up having these integrations behind the scene with the AMR for automated workflows and kind of various types of innovation. And it ended up that, and that was kind of the big aha for us, was it wasn't just about virtualizing the app. You need to deliver this orchestration of different applications for different use cases to the physicians with a Windows kind of within a Windows operating system, right? Most apps are still very much Windows centric in the healthcare space. And our realization was now the physicians really wanted to be able to have fluent access to all of these applications. So all of those third-party apps or the vendors that you mentioned effectively became participants in this overall ecosystem. Obviously, the challenge there is delivery, authentication, security, reliability. But that's really, that was fundamentally the IT challenge that we had to step up to.
So Farid, I think that's a good sort of segue around those challenges. Obviously, I think if we look at the timeline, you're a good 12 years, into that US EMR journey. What have customers experienced, and perhaps let's start on the challenges around that EMR adoption.
Right, yeah, and it's a good place to start. One thinks transformation is always kind of a rosy story, and the outcome is for sure. But looking back, there are certainly challenges that have been acknowledged. This is a kind of a snapshot based on feedback from participants. HIMSS. HIMSS is a Healthcare Information Management Systems Society, which is a US based nonprofit organization, and its mission in life is to facilitate a discourse between IT leadership, clinical leadership, and vendor leadership. And they kind of captured some feedback from customers, and you can kind of see the feedback very much kind of reflected an upfront, perhaps confusion may not be the right word, but maybe a little bit of concern that removal of paper was changing a lot of things. Physicians have been trained in a certain way, and much of that was being changed and was being challenged, obviously for good reasons. And then IT also realized that a lot of their delivery was now in line with care delivery, right? So there's a comfort zone factor both on the clinician side as well as on the IT side, and both parties kind of realize that all of a sudden they have to more or less kind of navigate to the center of that picture, and both have to kind of understand that this transformation is not going to come very easily, but obviously the outcome and the purpose is warranted.
Yeah, that shift from IT being ancillary to the delivery of care, with an EMR, we stepped over into it being critical, as you said, in line with delivery. And the implications of that have been huge on us. That is a little alarming. Sorry, go back, Will.
Sure.
The investment in EMR, which has become synonymous with digital healthcare equals an EMR, at least that is the first or a very big stepping stone towards it. The fact that 12 years into its significant adoption in the US, that it's still seen as not necessarily paying off. I'd like to understand, or, for us in Australia, we are still earlier in that journey. What's the very fragile part here? What's going on?
Well, there are two facets to this, right? Again, in line with both IT and the clinical community, kind of feeling that this transformation is testing some of the long practice exercises, and there was a kind of an ask for a little bit of a mind shift, right? That mind shift on the part of the physician is around recognizing that there is a higher need. Patient outcome is, en masse, requires single source of truth, shareable data, secure access, respect for privacy. I mean, those are all things that when things were on paper weren't necessarily top of mind, right? On the other hand, IT also realizes that as part of the clinicians kind of moving in that direction, IT needs to start to look at clinicians almost through the same lens as a product company looks at their consumers, which is experience matters, right? Reliability matters, ease of use matters. Right?
So I agree. That is my experience. I think maybe if we move to the next slide,
Right.
Just to set that up, the resilience, availability, reliability, security are all huge factors that we have to build into how we're delivering services, but also how easy is it to consume that experience.
Right, exactly. And this kind of plays into the fact that from a clinician perspective, they're interacting with a set of applications. They don't really care about what's under the covers, be it the device, the operating system, the form factor, the location, and so on. So the notion of a consumer oriented approach to IT and architecture is all about making sure that as we design solutions, we are not just mindful of experience becomes almost like a central premise to our design, right? Be it single sign-on, be it availability, be it device choice. Those are all key variables that we have to solve for. Otherwise, the clinician community will essentially say, well, we're kind of taking a big step towards really moving away from past practices in the interest of the larger good, and IT played their part.
Okay, so given that the consumer is now central, what actually does a good experience look like for those consumers?
Right. So the productivity is kind of top of mind in the U.S. There's obviously a lot of economic pressure, much more so now because of the COVID situation. But improving productivity translates to dollars and cents, right? There's a very direct correlation in terms of being able to save time for the physicians or for the clinicians to do IT-ish kind of work, whether it's multiple authentications or kind of having to go to a specific device for, accessing radiology and so on, right? So every time we are able to cut a step or shortcut these things, that directly translates to the clinicians being able to be more productive, see more patients, and so on. So there was there've been some time and motion studies really focused on authentication, and this really goes into the heart of that follow me desktop functionality, which was to use a term, the killer app back in the day, and still is, where they more or less measured the number of times clinicians had to authenticate to their desktop and application over a course of a shift, right? And what that translated to, if you essentially had a virtual desktop at your disposal, where you might pay, an upfront, time to authenticate and access, but then from that point on, everything else falls in line with just a disconnect and reconnect mode, right? And if you tally up the numbers, you'll find that the actual savings are quite substantial, right? In this particular case, 10 minutes per hour, right? If you're looking at a network that might have, 5 to 10,000 physicians, clinicians, that is a tremendous additional bandwidth that they would have to really focus on care delivery rather than IT. Beyond that, we saw also that ease of support is part of that experiential thing, right? So we're all familiar with with IT kind of doing triage and root cause analysis at user time, right? So they get into the desktop and they ask questions, and obviously the and so on. In this kind of environment with this framework, virtualization allows for a much more fluent way of handling these kind of issues. Some of them may be as radical as simply logging out and going back in, with a guarantee that you will have a fresh session, and you don't have to waste any time trying to decipher and assess what the issue was, right? So time to resolution all of a sudden became instantaneous rather than several minutes with a help desk call and so on. So that generated a lot of interest, because then almost like self-healing was almost a term that was used, given that I can just simply log out and log back in.
That's good. And then the final one, an enabling choice for it.
Right, and so that also plays into the whole experience thing, right? Choice is generally not something that used to be a prevalent theme in traditional end user compute. It's all about a particular image, a particular set of hardware, and a support model. Choice essentially goes from multiple device types, right? Mac, tablets, Windows, and so on, but also choice around location and different modalities, right? Whether you're on vacation, you're at home, you're in your office, on your way to the hospital, right? So providing choice to the physician, to the clinicians, really allows them to really find different ways to incorporate care delivery steps within their preferred mode of work.
So I'm going to
that as the 3 takeaways. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
I'm going to add in here that enabling choice. The way that I look at it is we're winning the hearts and minds of the clinicians, and this enablement of choice, how they do their work, where they do their work, is so empowering for clinicians that going all the way back into the early 2010s, that we were having doctors, this is at the SAN at that time, in writing, putting things like, "This has changed my life," because they were able to plan out how they're going to approach their day more, see where patients are, be able to respond to things remotely, and it really was a huge change for them. So if that hasn't yet happened in your workspace, it may sound very emotive to say we want to build technology that people love, and it actually is possible to do that rather than them fighting with it to be able to get the information they need to do their job. The other part about improved productivity, I see that in a couple of ways. Just specifically with VDI, this feeds into the design requirements. For me, seeing VDI used over a long period of time, just because you have a platform doesn't mean it's going to perform well and the users are going to have a good experience. So actually building in performance criteria is really important. And for us at the SAN, which was the sandbox, we ended up going for 5 seconds to connect consistently. So the experience has to be consistent, that when a clinician or anyone in the clinical workforce or using VDI, in the course of their workflow, when they're connecting, they can be certain that in 5 seconds they're going to be connected to where they were, no matter what device they log in from. And that performance requires ongoing, commitment to retaining an environment that can deliver that, and all of the analytics and investment around it. So there's a lot behind delivering these outcomes, and some of these things are what we will be digging into later in the session.
Well, I was going to say, probably next. But I think to summarise some of that is certainly possible to do it right. There's different things coming in there, but certainly measuring it, baking it into the design requirements. I think it's really interesting what you say, because a lot of the work I do is around, well, we need it to be faster. It's got to be 10 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever. Mm-hmm. But actually it's the consistency that was most valuable. It's we're consistently in at that time. So
that's right.
Something
so
to
that
think about.
A person can build it into their workflow, that expectation. Even if they gather their thoughts, they know how long it's going to take. Yeah. So really important.
Cool. Well, I suppose that, again, you just mentioned workflows, Bob. So let's go into let's get into the next layer of detail around the technology fundamentals. And like you say, for us, it's really around that workflow aspect. So from so we start off on the virtualization side. From this angle, like we've said already, we want to think about the workflow, the particular role of that clinician or whoever it might be, the consultant. If we think about some of these that are on the screen, the shared clinical desktops we've talked about already, is that always on point of care or follow me desktop, that ability to log in once, potentially augmented by something like a proximity card as well, and then let it roam to you no matter where you are within the different wards or campuses, versus things like something like the remote clinical workflow, which might be a restricted set of applications, and certainly a more restrictive set of security requirements, because we're now delivering that remotely for someone who's perhaps on call to deliver a second opinion. But with competitive environments, typically we see that being another master image, another sort of set of apps baked into that, duplication of effort. It's important we can, still serve that up, but configure it appropriately. Similar to the doctor's workspace, perhaps that's more of a core set of applications. Again, there might be a restricted set of clinical apps in there because of, legislation and access to patient data. And then if you look kind of towards the right, this is where you might want, you could deliver it out of a virtual desktop, or it might be a published application. So just a single app that still gives you that fast user switching. The contractor workspace, you might have a different sort of set of constraints around that. It might be a temporary thing. Give access to a set of contractors to do something for a period of time for that project, or it might be ongoing vendor access or something. Again, tight security requirements around that. You don't want to have to set up separate sets of infrastructure to deal with it. And I think we've deliberately put the arrow in. There's so many use cases that we come across around healthcare, in the region. Barb, I know there was some interesting ones you did.
Yeah, so a couple of almost random things that came up. One is, I guess they're commonly called patient journey boards or e-boards, where there's a large format display in a ward with patient lists on them with their locations, etc., generally out of the admissions, discharge and transfer system. And we used VDI for that in theatre lounges for putting up the real-time rosters and theatre lists. Another use case that was very valuable is in building an integrated cancer service. The multidisciplinary teams, which are now good practice for cancer delivery, having VDI available in the MDT meeting rooms where people from different organisations, such as external pathology providers and radiation oncology, etc., are bringing in their own data sources, and we were able to facilitate them accessing their home systems by brokering VDI. So it did seem a while ago like a bit of a silver bullet. Now there are more sophisticated ways of doing some stuff, but it very much has a place in a whole bunch of use cases.
Yeah, that's it. And in terms of the platform for it, what we're getting at here is having that single platform and the common infrastructure. So what do you think about when you're designing that blue layer on the screen?
Yeah, so just to kind of finish what Barb was mentioning in the US, so these use cases are already very much understood, and most organizations have kind of leveraged them. We are seeing now these additional use cases, and hence the arrow to the right, which one example that I would like to call out that may be applicable is also the fact that in the US there's been a tremendous consolidation of providers, which essentially means that a large provider has footprint mostly in the urban centers. However, obviously we have these rural community hospitals and clinicians, and those community providers are effectively now becoming satellites, which means that they get tied into the mothership, if you will, in terms of accessing the same EMR, the same authentication method, and so on. So the notion of community care is very much top of mind, and that is a use case. It's not a separate technology solution, but it's a use case which does require some very specific considerations. So I just want to kind of point that out, that red arrow is actually not just a few use cases. There are a number of additional use cases that are waiting in line for that. So the idea is, with the assumption that there are existing use cases and many more to come, we IT needs to make sure that we think very clearly around those fundamentals of the platform, as enumerated on the lower side of this diagram, around security and scale and resilience, and ensuring that there is a consistent way of doing that. Failing that essentially forces these use cases to become silos in their own right? They have their own authentication, their own application delivery, and so on. And silo is kind of the opposite of IT efficiency, consistency, lower cost, and experience, right? So really the takeaway is, IT has to realize that these verticals are use cases rather than distinct solutions. And I know the nuance, they're in my view, again, maybe an engineer's view, there are differences between the two, right? A solution may warrant a different set of technologies. A use case is effectively leveraging an existing platform for new ways to innovate, right? And I think there's a lot of interest in the US and I'm sure in ANZ around making sure that the platform is architected in a manner that facilitates not just current use cases, but also future ones.
Yeah, agreed, Farid. And I think, to tee us up to go into the platform a little bit more, one of the things we were discussing previously is like you say, there are use cases. You're going to have a mix. Typically we end up talking about virtual desktops and app virtualization. And typically we see, our competitors in this space be more on the app virtualization space, whereas, you've done a lot more and we do a lot more here locally, to one of the questions in the chat, around virtual desktops as well. So perhaps with that, let's just have a chat about the platform, because like you said, I think, the silo thing is something I get asked about quite a bit as well. And I know there's a question in the chat, in the Q&A has been put in just around these fresh VM sessions and from a Horizon perspective, we see that as being a real differentiator. The single stack. So that sort of one throat to choke, from hypervisor up into, into the brokering layer. The gateway is part of the Horizon components. It's just a virtual appliance. The advantage of having that single stack is that what we tend to find is that we actually did a survey, actually just very, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, around the number of FTEs that we have running our Horizon environments locally in Australia and New Zealand. And generally the feedback was that it's literally one or two people for several thousand desktops, generally averaging about perhaps the 4 to 6 mark. But generally when it got up to that 4 to 6 mark, it was because those teams are looking after the entire stack that you see on the screen, but also then the infrastructure for lots of other things, all the, the data center technologies as well. And so to Farid's point, just around the use cases is you've got that platform, you've got a single team doing it. Whereas, typically what we see in Citrix environments as an example is you've got an infrastructure layer, you then got the Citrix team, you might have an applications team. And to give you an example, the instant clone technology that is built into vSphere. That's our single image management technology. That is what it gives us that idea of that fresh VM session every time the clinician is logged off after their shift or overnight or however we put the policy in. When that VM gets logged off, it will be destroyed and it will be spun up on demand when the next person comes to log in. So it gives you that piece. But from an administrative point of view, you just do that from within the Horizon console. Same for vSAN. You don't have to worry too much about the hyperconverged, storage aspect. As a Horizon administrator, it's in the console, so it's aware of it. And Farid, I know you talk about instant clones a lot from a security angle. Let's just explore that. Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea, and this kind of goes back to the core, right? So we said IT is in line with care delivery, right? So going down isn't an option. But we also said that the clinical desktop is getting more and more complicated, right? So when you put the two together, you find that configuration management becomes really almost like a number one priority, right? And configuration management is all about making sure that you're current with your updates. And number two, you've got adequate testing going on. And number three, you don't have drift. Right now, in a more traditional environment where you've got an independent operating system with set of applications and configurations out there by the thousands, right? So if you've got an environment with 20,000, endpoints, you've got 20,000 independent instances of Windows in this case, each of which can drift, right? Drift is IT's nemesis because at some point the assumption is I know what I got out there. But when you got 20,000 independent, instances of the operating system, there's a more than zero chance that, many of that 20,000 is actually not what we think it is, right? So the notion of guaranteed zero drift. That may sound like a marketing buzzword. It isn't. It actually is, from my perspective, almost like the IT nirvana, right? If somebody can guarantee that there is zero drift out there across a large population of endpoints, that is a significant step towards ensuring the kind of reliability we're trying to solution here. So
yeah,
that's kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, for sure. And it, I end up talking a lot about the help desk angle as well. Obviously, from a troubleshooting perspective, that's helpful because it is that, whatever patch level, and you can get in and look at things. Now, the next stage in the stack, we go up into the apps on demand and the dynamic environment manager components. So these layer on to that instant clone sort of non-persistent desktop and help you deliver environmental settings, application settings, personalization, so saving out personalization. And there's a question in the in the Q&A just around, so if you do have this fresh VM session every day, do we need to modify the clinical applications to ensure they're aware of the non-persistent, or we need to modify them to store personal preferences? The answer is no. With things like apps on demand, we capture the installation of that application as it would be installed on a physical desktop, or you capture it into a virtual machine. That gets captured out into a virtual disk, and we actually inject that when the clinician goes and actually double clicks and goes, right, I need to use this application. It gets mounted immediately. It's there. It works as though it is installed natively. So if it's in C program files, wherever, that's where it's going to be. Dynamic environment manager is then the thing that looks at the personalization aspect to the question. If they go and lay it out in a different way, customize the settings, which to be honest, in clinical applications, we typically don't see too much customization, but if the app has that ability, then we capture that into the dynamic environment manager profile. The next time you come in, you might be on virtual desktop 1001 instead of number 1. It will look as though it's still your desktop, so you're getting that persistent experience, except under the covers it's all non-persistent.
Yeah, we see the dynamic environment manager also play a big role in having these multiple use cases, because you can embed different policies, security and privacy policies. Example, meaning having a policy that says if the IP address of the endpoint is off premise, you may not be allowed to do cut and paste, or you may be able to do cut and paste one way and not the other way, right? So the DEM kind of plays that role to create that level of consistency across multiple use cases because of all the smart policies you can embed in it.
Yeah, and we have found cases where those security policies can actually help you remove some of the security agents that may have come, if you're doing the move from physical to virtual. Security always wants to use the same tool sets. Look at what's in the stack, because you can often remove that, and actually that's going to improve performance and reduce your cost as well. So let's now look at, so we've concentrated quite a bit on the virtualization piece, but we do want to finish up on expanding out into the workspace. Farid, you've said it, this is very common in the US. The EMR vendors are now moving beyond Windows. And obviously we see this across all the other applications. Well, you've got SaaS apps, you've got these mobile apps, cross-platform. So really what the digital clinical workspace does is build on that virtualization foundation on the left, and then help you go and deliver the mobile clinical workflows. Perhaps it gives you the option around making the best use out of your investment in the mobile devices, particularly tablet form factors. Why not do user switching, log them in as a patient kiosk, allow the patients to look at, watch TV, watch YouTube, that kind of thing, whilst they're not in use by the clinician. And like we said, security is paramount. It needs to be baked in intrinsically. So that's kind of the marketing scene. Farid, let's have a chat about what the functional architecture looks like.
Right. So view this as a non-marketing engineer's view of this thing that we're kind of referencing, which is bringing everything we just talked about together, right? So security, multiple use cases, virtualization, mobility, and so on. If we were to kind of bring them all together and have them more or less define a space, the anatomy of that space is kind of characterized in this diagram, right? We have the traditional Windows-based apps and so on. So that's table stakes for the most part. But given the prevalence of different use cases, it has to have various elements of zero trust built into it systematically and intrinsically. There's a notion of a portal, and that plays out quite a bit, and we'll talk about this. And obviously, endpoint management becomes a key discipline. And then last but certainly not least is the user experience. And the idea is, how do we affect these 5 different vectors as part of a functional architecture? So, Barb, what's your pick of the 5 here that you want to be able to kind of maybe have us anchor the conversation?
Sure. I'm gonna go with digital front door. That is very front and center in the ANZ market. Means a little bit of different thing to different people. From the perspective of a clinician engaging with a health services provider, whether that's a public or private healthcare system, I guess the virtualization as in VI does cover off what is required for on-premise quite well. But that's not the only place that clinical workloads are run now. They're not all in the clinical setting, and there is a plethora of other applications that a clinician might use. And how do they navigate that seamlessly, given that doctors, half of them are complaining there's too much tech. It's difficult to navigate. So from a clinician's perspective, that digital front door, what does that look like here?
Yeah, if maybe you go to the next slide, we'll be able to kind of do a little bit of a visual here. So if I may provide some narration here. So view this thing as a portal, and the portal consists of entitled applications. So these are apps that could be available to a clinician, and as you can kind of see from the call out icons, they run the gamut in terms of different types of apps, right? It ranges from legacy Windows applications that have some limitations around compatibility to web apps, internal web applications, external SaaS applications, published apps, and obviously VDI, virtual desktops, right? The idea here is at any given point in time, the clinicians may need to access any of these icons, and how do we make sure that to them, these are just icons. We hide the plumbing, for lack of a better term, in terms of how the application is actually delivered to the clinician, right? So it becomes a curated experience, number one. So it's ease of use, single sign-on, right? So they are authenticated to the portal, and therefore using certificate-based authentication behind the scene, we can allow them to basically navigate and access each of these tiles without having to authenticate again, right? It's curated because up at the top, you'll see these tabs that allow them to see the application catalog, things like a tab for help services. They can chat with a help desk agent if needed. There are notifications, and there are different ways you can curate this so it becomes not just a jump point for apps, it's a destination that they get to, and then from there, they know that through single sign-on, they have easy east-west access to applications, while at the same time, there's some productivity features in it. So I would consider this as a portal strategy that subsumes the notion of a digital front door.
Yeah, and just to add to the notifications piece, we're seeing a big uptick with that. It's giving you a trusted way of communicating with the user community. Don't think of this as just IT notifications, although it's very helpful that if there's an email outage, for instance, that the amount of customers go, oh yeah, we emailed out about that. Probably not the best plan. Or the SMS, based messages for perhaps, an evacuation or, crisis management kind of thing. Everyone's suspicious of SMSs. Everyone's had so many phishing SMSs. You've now got this way for HR, for the business and for IT to go and, message with the users.
Yeah, very, very targeted, extremely targeted messaging. Yes.
And for it, so it sounds great. So you said single sign-on, passwordless access, great, but we need a lock on the door, right? So perhaps let's look at the flip side of that, which is the zero trust architecture and that framework.
Right. Yeah. So zero trust again has become a buzzword. Just predated AI as another buzzword, but zero trust architecture fundamentally recognizes that there are at least four dimensions to trust. There is the user and who the user is, and if they can prove they are who they are. Well, that's pretty much upfront. Where is the user? Are they on-prem? Are they off-prem? Are they in country? Are they out of country? And so on and so on. So the location of the user is one of the vectors. The third vector is what device is the user on, right? Is it a trusted device or not a trusted device? The fourth vector is the application entitlement. Is the user trying to access a sensitive application or a productivity application, and so on, right? A fifth one has entered the picture, which is this risk of the user, right? We have users that perhaps in the past have demonstrated maybe a lack of attention to phishing attacks and so on, and they've had some some challenges. And there is some technology there that allows us to stitch in the user risk profile as part of the calculus, right? But the idea of zero trust is you apply corporate policies that factor these particular use cases that says, I'm a contractor, I'm off premise, I'm trying to access a sensitive app on a device that has a valid certificate. What's the policy there? Well, maybe the corporate policy is simply apply multi-factor authentication and you're off and running, right? So the zero trust security basically says recognize these vectors and then incorporate them in your digital front door experience. That's your policy enforcement point where all of these things effectively become adjudicated.
Yeah, great. All right, what should we do next then, Barb?
End user.
All right,
End user experience.
So we've touched on experience a little bit, but yeah, let's build on that. Where's this space going?
That's where it all comes home, in my opinion. Traditional IT has always kind of measured its services through what we call SLAs. We're all familiar with the term SLA, service level agreements. In this brave new world where experience matters and is actually essential to much of the work in the architecture, the SLA is kind of taking a back seat to this notion of sentiment, right? Sentiment is, what is my satisfaction with this service, and what's the propensity of me going to my peer and essentially have positive influence in terms of the selection and the experience, right? So we're seeing organizations now really leveraging the digital front door experience, the VDI flexibility as a way to deliver what Barbara mentioned earlier, something that they love. It's a very non-IT term, and there was a day when I never thought that was ever going to be an IT term at all. But user experience is fundamentally the so what of much of this. Is it easy? Is it reliable? Do they like it? And can we apply changes and adjustments without requiring years of work, effectively modifying the experience based on feedback, right? Organizations are now looking at KPIs that are really delivered based on Net Promoter Score rather than SLA. Sorry, Will.
Yeah, sorry for it. To add to that, you mentioned sentiment as well. So we talked about measurement already. It's always inherent. It's important right from the design phase. But yeah, we're now going up into really to get proactive. We want to gather even more feedback. We need to use the analytics to focus our efforts to address issues before they impact the user base. And the sentiment piece I just want to touch on, we talked about that notification framework. Through that framework, we also have the ability to do surveys to actually just get that more anecdotal surveys. Are you having a problem? Or give us your feedback, not just we think you're having a good experience by all the telemetry, but let's go and survey them when needed, which is an interesting concept.
That's right. Yeah. So the assumption is you have analytics under the covers, and you can have very, very directed, targeted micro surveys that are designed to capture, again, that sentiment as a way to track whether we're doing the right thing or not.
Yeah. So let's finish up on the endpoint management side of things.
Right. So we know that the world of only Windows out there is gone, right? Pretty much all organizations recognize that there is a heterogeneous device environment out there. And then this is just a snapshot of the types of devices that we typically see in healthcare environments, ranging from tablets to rugged devices to obviously workstation on wheels, Macs, and so on, right? So the idea is, given what we talked about, right, those key North Star kind of dimensions for us, so experience, reliability, consistency, and security, right? Given that, how do we go about dealing with these heterogeneous device types in terms of operating system and ways of managing them? And the way we see customers really going at this is applying modern management. So modern management is a term that more or less kind of started as Android and iOS became very popular. The fundamental architecture of the operating system is different from Windows that predates these by 20 or 30 years. So modern management allows us to effectively have a single pane of glass across multiple operating systems. Hence the term unified endpoint management that says I'm on an admin console and I see my entire estate, regardless of the operating system, and I can manage that estate through a single set of variables and policies. Obviously, at the bottom of that stack, obviously OS matters, but the idea is you leverage these modern techniques to bring about this single silo view of device management rather than multiple silos.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Farid. Any parting comments from you? I'm conscious of time. We're going to wrap up now, but anything you'd like to add, Barb? Or...
I think just really quickly, Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows 7, the reality is for many customers we're dealing with, they're still trying to deal with Windows 7, let alone 10. And that's on, it's a ticking time bomb as well. So being able to manage these, let's call them legacy environments, as well as actually really critical. Yeah. I think, Farid, you're experiencing that in the US as well, right?
Yeah. Maybe I wouldn't use the term ticking time bomb, but one of the things that we're starting to see as the end of life milestone for Windows 10 is now looming into the future, specifically October of 2025, less than 2 years away. Organizations that basically made the jump from Windows or out of Windows 7 into Windows 10 are realizing that the hardware that they have is unable to run Windows 11, right? And many of them are now caught in this kind of situation where, do we continue buying more hardware even though the current hardware still has life, or do we start to kind of entertain other ways of managing these endpoints and delivering services? But in these scenarios, I have one customer that has over 20,000 machines that will not run Windows 11, and they're really thinking of repurposing these machines as effectively thin clients, leveraging VDI and app virtualization as really a directional and a strategic way to change the way they handle the endpoints.
Yeah, Farida, and I think that's the power of the platform, having all of these options at your disposal. So with that, we are out of time. Thanks, Barb. Thanks, Farid. I hope you've enjoyed the session, everyone. Really today was about just highlighting some of those themes, thinking from a strategic perspective, what we should be thinking now into the future. Next week, we're going to talk about the how. So how do you reduce the risk of change, that best practice and lessons learned, deployment methodologies, again, all that kind of process bit. And again, we'll have a good discussion around that. Thanks to those of you who have asked questions. Feel free, if there's a lot of stuff we have discussed, give us your feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback. There is an option in there, or we'll hang around for a couple of minutes if you want to put it into the chat, but not in the chat, the Q&A box. But yes, thanks. If you do have questions, use that form, let us know. And as I say, we're going to do even more of a discussion next week, so we're happy to address them then.
Yes,
and with that, I think we're 3 seconds over, so not too bad. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.